Good morning. Welcome to Catalyst and our Sunday online service. If you're joining us today for the first time, I'm John Murray, lead pastor of Catalyst Vineyard Church in Ithaca, New York. And today, we are on message number 8 in our 12-part summer series entitled Faithful, Fueling Your Faith in a World on Empty. And if you've been with us, you know that we've been focused on the book of Hebrews, which was written by an author unknown to Jesus-believing Jews. And these Jesus-believing Jews were facing troubles. They were facing persecution and opposition. And this author is basically trying to give them instructions on to how to make sure they finish the race that he's pointing out. Because we've been looking primarily at Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, where it says this: "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd or cloud of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip or throw off every weight, everything that slows us down, hinders us, especially the sin that so easily trips us up or entangles us, and let us run with endurance, perseverance, the race, the path God has marked out before us." And we've been talking about these dimensions, and we've talked particularly about the cloud of witnesses. We said, you know what, we can hear the voice of Abraham saying, keep believing. We can hear the voice of Jacob saying, keep fighting. We can hear the voice of the others, the unnamed people in Hebrews 11 that are saying to us, keep perspective. And we've also talked about the fact that in order to run this race, we have to be unhindered. In other words, we need to be unhindered by anxiety, which hinders so many people with depression. And we need to also be unchained from religion, from practices that are following laws instead of Jesus. And we also need to be unleashed from lies that we've believed from the author of lies, Satan. And we also need to, as we talked about last week, we need to be untangled from the sin of unbelief. But today, we're going to pivot, and we're going to go towards this race that we're running and begin talking about how to run with endurance. But first, our Catalyst worship team is going to lead us in 2 songs of worship, and then I'll be back to share today's message entitled Obstacle Course.
Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me yet. Waiting for change to come, knowing the battle's won, for you have never failed me yet. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you've never failed me yet. I know the night won't last, your word will come to pass. My heart will sing your praise again. Jesus, you're still enough. Keep me within your love. My heart will sing your praise again. Ooh. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you've never still stands. Great is your faithfulness, your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You've never failed me yet.
You are here, moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you, I worship you. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are here, touching every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, healing every heart. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, turning lives around. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, mending every heart. I worship you, I worship you. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. 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 You are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. And you are waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness, my God, that is who you are. And you are here, moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. You are here, working in this place. I worship you, I worship you.
So in the mid-1980s, when our daughters, Candace and Christine, Kathy and my daughters, they were in a stroller, and we were living on the hospital grounds, I signed up for a marathon. The name of the marathon was called the Wineglass Marathon, and it actually still exists. It's a marathon now that goes from Painted Post to Corning. Back then, it went in the opposite direction. It went from Corning to Painted Post. And so I signed up for this marathon that I had never run a marathon before, not even a half marathon. And someone told me, you just need to train up to 18 miles. And if you do that, you'll be good to go. And so that's what I did. I trained up to 18 miles. And then when I started in the marathon, when I actually started running, less than a mile into it, I began to have pains in my right knee. And I had never had pains in my knee when I ran before, and it began to go into my mind, how am I going to ever finish this race? And I began to identify why the word race in Greek is agon, or agony, because I began to experience agony, and this race for me was not going to be a fun run. It was going to be no fun run. In other words, I was on a race that was going to be extremely challenging, and from the very beginning, I wasn't sure if I was going to finish. And I think in life, the races we go on are often like that, aren't they? I mean, some of us had the impression that when we signed up to follow Jesus, it was going to be a fun run. In other words, all our troubles were going to go away. All the obstacles that would come before us, they were going to all be just cast away because we were going to be living in the blessing and we wouldn't experience any of the cursing. But that's actually not what Jesus promised us. Jesus promised us troubles in this world. You will have troubles, he said, but take courage. And so in this run, I knew I was in trouble from the very beginning. And what I want to point out to you today is that there's an amazing story in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, where we can read about someone who ran a race and experienced a lot of obstacles. Not too different than the Hebrews 11 faith heroes that we read about, the 15 big names and then the no names. Basically, this individual's name is Nehemiah. And there's a book in the Old Testament that is written by Nehemiah, and it's his story, his account. And Nehemiah was somebody who was actually a part of Israel when they had been captured and taken to a foreign land. The Babylonians had captured Israel, and they had taken them to a foreign land, and then they were conquered by the Persians. And so when Nehemiah shows up, he's the cupbearer to a king. And being the cupbearer of a king basically means he was the wine taster who made sure that nobody was giving wine with poison to the king. And so it was a cushy job in some regards, but it was a high-risk enterprise. It was not a job that everyone necessarily wanted to have, but that's the job that Nehemiah had. And so he was in the king's palace in his job. And he knew that Jerusalem, which was far away, 1,000 miles away, and it was basically 1,400 years away in terms of how long it had been since it had been in its heyday in the promised land when everything was going well and the city of Jerusalem was at its best. And it was a faraway thought to him. But his brother shows up, having just been there with some other individuals. And here's what happens. They said to Nehemiah, those who survived the exile, those who were still in Jerusalem and are back in the province are in great trouble and great disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. They're in cinder. And when I heard these things, I sat down and wept. This really broke Nehemiah. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So basically, this news to Nehemiah, it was heart-wrenching. It was something that basically began to just unwind him in where he was at in terms of in his life. And what I want to do today is take a look at 4 obstacles that Nehemiah faced once he knew what the state of Jerusalem was, as he got this heart to go there and do something about it. And the first one is the obstacle of indifference. Basically, it's the obstacle that keeps us from running. It's the obstacle that causes someone to not sign up and actually show up for the race. And I think many of us get derailed before we even get started. And in the case of Nehemiah, he had every reason to not sign up. He was the cupbearer to the king. I mean, he could have said, you know what? God is good. God has given me this amazing job. And so why would I do anything else? This must be an indication that God is blessing me. I have this job as the cupbearer to the king. And psychologists have labeled this sort of attitude, this attitude of indifference, as the bystander effect. And it's a phenomenon when you see something that's wrong, when you see something that really is asking for action, you do nothing. In other words, instead of being a participant or instead of being a responder, you're a spectator. And today, that's even more prevalent because what people do today is they just begin to document what's happening, but they don't get involved. They're just waiting for some hero to show up. And they began to film it on their iPhone and capture the event. But instead of actually intervening, they're just documenting. And so this kind of doing nothing situation is something that I think all of us struggle with at times. Should I actually do something? Should I actually get involved in this? And there's another phenomena, which is actually the one that hits Nehemiah. It's the one that caused him to fall down and weep. And it's called a holy discontent. I like to call it the Popeye moment. And you've all probably seen Popeye. I hope you have. If you're too young to have seen Popeye, you should look him up. Because Popeye the Sailor Man, I grew up watching Popeye. And he had this girlfriend. Her name was Olive Oyl, O-Y-L. And he also had this villain that he had to deal with all the time. His name was Brutus. He was just this big brute guy. And there was another guy, another character. And he sort of depicts the bystander effect. His name was Wimpy. And Wimpy was just more about eating than fighting. He was the guy that would sit on the sidelines. And so with that picture, what often would happen in these Popeye stories is there would be a point in time when Brutus was basically picking on Olive. And there was a point at which Popeye always would come to the place of holy discontent when he'd say, that's all I can stand, and I can't stand no more. And then he would squeeze the spinach would fly up in the air, and I think it would actually fall down into his pipe, and he would eat it. And all of a sudden, he was no longer a wimpy guy. He was a fighter, and he would kick Brutus's butt. And that was the kind of holy discontent moment that Nehemiah experienced when he fell down and wept. And then the next obstacle that Nehemiah faced was the obstacle of insufficiency. And that's when we look at ourselves and say, I'm not really qualified to do that. In other words, we eliminate ourselves not because we think that we're indifferent about it. Maybe you have a discontent, but you say, I'm not qualified to do anything about it. I don't have the ability. I don't have the education. I'm too old. I'm too young. I'm too big. I'm too small, whatever the case might be. But the interesting thing about Nehemiah is Nehemiah just didn't say, I'm just a cupbearer to the king. I'm not a contractor. How am I going to rebuild the wall? He did something else. He prayed. He prayed for 4 months. He prayed and fasted for 4 months. And the result of that is what we read about in chapter 2 when it says this. It says that, so the king asked me, and the king was observing Nehemiah, and he says, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid. He didn't want to tell the king what he was feeling, but he said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city, i.e. Jerusalem, where my ancestors are buried, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? And then the king said to me, what is it you want? And that statement, that question, was the breakthrough that Nehemiah needed. That statement was the breakthrough that would turn him from insufficiency to sufficiency. It was what I would call a one-day moment. It was one of those breakthrough moments when all of a sudden you become enabled to do what you're being called to do. This holy discontent all of a sudden has a pathway to express itself. And essentially what happened was he told the king his plight, and the king basically said, well, hey, I'm going to give you letters of authority, letters of authorization to take to the governors so that nobody bothers you. And I'm also going to give you timber to rebuild the walls. And I'm also going to give you armed guards to go with you. You're going to be good to go, Nehemiah. You should have no problems. I'm going to just set you on course. And then Nehemiah headed to Jerusalem. But when he got there, he experienced another obstacle, another sort of part of the Spartan race that God had him on, an obstacle that is called opposition, the obstacle of opposition. And that actually essentially came up in the form of some local governing officials. One of them was the name Sanballat, and the other was Tobiah. And basically, Tobiah and Sanballat, they begin harassing Nehemiah. They begin mocking him. In fact, Tobiah comes up with this little story. He said, you know what, you're going to build this wall and a fox is going to run up on it. It's going to fall over. They basically were trying to keep him from starting. In other words, they were saying to Nehemiah, it'll never work. It'll never be finished. You just need to give up right now before you get started. And I love what Cal Eidelman says in his book, Don't Give Up, about this. He said this. He said, Nehemiah has said yes to God. And that means saying yes to facing opposition. And most of us don't equate that. That's just how it works. Sometimes we say, I ran into a problem. That means that it isn't God's will. We get the idea that a smooth track, blessings, proves God is on your side. Bumps in the road are a heavenly thumbs down. In other words, troubles means you're going in the wrong direction. But what if it's just the opposite? Sometimes when you face roadblocks, you must be doing the right thing. And that was what was being experienced by Nehemiah. In other words, do you remember Newton's third law of momentum? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. What's true in the physical realm tends to play out in the spiritual realm. In other words, for every spiritual action, there's an equal and opposite spiritual reaction. And you know what we call that? We call that spiritual warfare. We call that being at war with our enemy, which is depicted in the scriptures from the very beginning. And Satan is the one who is the destroyer. I mean, it's interesting to note that God is a creator. God is a restorer, a rebuilding, but Satan is the destroyer. Jesus said in John 10:10, the thief or the enemy, the devil, comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And if that's what you're experiencing, sometimes it really means you're on the right path because you're threatening the enemy, just like Tobias and Sanballat were threatened when the building started to go up of the walls. And then the fourth obstacle that Nehemiah runs into is what we call the obstacle of slow progress. And I think all of us have experienced this. It's when you begin to look at the glass, and instead of looking like it's half full, it looks like it's half empty. So we read about this in the 4th chapter of Nehemiah when it says this, so we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. For the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they, in other words, God's enemies, were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. In other words, I experienced this kind of opposition. I experienced this kind of slow progress. It's sort of like, well, geez, it's not finished yet when I was running the Rhine-Glass Marathon, because at mile 20, I came up with a great idea. I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just walk for a while. I mean, that way I'll still finish, but I need a little break in this action. I need to sort of maybe slow down and let my joints recover and let my mind recover. And so I started walking. I don't recommend that. I couldn't start running again. It was like my joint froze up. And that's when you begin to say to yourself, what's the point? In other words, why continue? And what it says in Nehemiah is it says that everywhere they turned, they were attacked. And so they began to say, what's the point? We're going to lose. And it's sort of like when you start a diet, you're 3 days into your diet, and then all of a sudden you go by the Golden Arches where it says you deserve a break today. And you're thinking, hey, it's time to pull into McDonald's right now. I deserve a break in my diet, right? And that's the end of the diet. Or it's that same kind of thing that happens when you're like 1 month into the plan to pay off your debts. All of a sudden you look and say, wow, my bank account's looking pretty good. I think I'm going to pull that card back out of hiding, and I'm going to actually go use it. I deserve a break today, right? Or again, if I've started a quiet time early in the morning from 5 to 6 a.m., but then all of a sudden, I'm on this Netflix series, and I just go onto a Netflix binge and stay up, past midnight, and then the next morning the alarm goes off, and I say to myself, I deserve a break today. I mean, isn't that the kind of thing that can take us off of the course? When we begin to basically see slow progress as no progress. And there was 4 things that I can see that Nehemiah did to deal with this slow progress phenomena. First thing he did was he embraced the obstacles. And he did that when it says that Nehemiah did an inspection. He walked around the walls and he was looking for not what wasn't done so much as what had been accomplished. He began to praise God for what had already been done. He began to see what had already been accomplished, and that gave courage to him. And then the next thing he did was he began to persevere in prayer. And you see prayer all through Nehemiah. In fact, it's more like a prayer journal, like a 2,500-year-old prayer journal, because it's from the beginning to the end. And at this point, he starts praying. And he basically says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the great and awesome, inspiring Lord, and fight. Fight for your countrymen. Fight for your sons and your daughters and your wives. Fight for your homes. You know, it's almost like a Braveheart speech that Nehemiah gives, because he now knows that it's more than just prayer. He needs to make a declaration of what God is doing on this work on the wall. He's now seeing the half full cup. He's now actually identified what's already been done. And then the third thing was he gathered them as one. And I think this is so interesting because he noticed the fact that they were so spread out as they were working on the walls that they became isolated. And when they were isolated, they were more apt to begin to think about what wasn't done on the wall, to look at that half-empty glass, to basically see slow progress. But what he did was he said, you know what, when you guys hear me blow the horn, I want you to gather at that place in the wall where you hear the horn, and we're going to come together and we're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate what God is already doing, and we're going to pray and be together. And basically, we're going to declare that our God will fight for us. We're going to declare that he is with us and among us. And isn't that similar to what the writer of Hebrews is talking about in Hebrews 10, where he says, let us consider how or discover creative ways that we may motivate one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting, gathering together like Nehemiah was gathering them around the wall, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more frequently as you see the day of Jesus' return approaching. This is not a Lone Ranger activity following Jesus. If we want to be successful, if we want to be able to finish the wall, if we want to be able to finish what God has called us to do, we need to do it together in fellowship with others, doing the one another's of encouraging and exhorting one another. And so as we study this building of the wall, and we begin to think about how long did it take to finish, one of the most interesting things is as they built the wall, half of them worked on the wall while half of them were basically at war. Basically, they were armed and watching for the enemy to come. And even the ones that were bringing the building materials in, they had building materials in one hand and a weapon in the other. And so as they were holding these weapons in their hand, and as they were gathered together as one, they never stopped building. They never gave up. They never quit. It's tied to the book, don't give up. They never stopped building. And this wall took how long to rebuild? I mean, we ask ourselves, do you know how long the wall took to rebuild? I mean, we might think it must have taken years, coach. It must have taken, 10 years or 20 years, or I don't know. But here's the amazing thing. As we read chapter 6, verses 15 to 16, it says this: the wall was completed in 52 days. On the 25th day of the month, Elul, which is mid-September, when all our enemies heard this, all the enemies of God heard this, you might think. All the surrounding nations were intimidated. They were afraid, and they lost their confidence. The detractors lost their confidence, for they realized that this task, this work, had been accomplished, done by our God. They realized that it wasn't Nehemiah and the Israelites. It was the God of Israel that accomplished this amazing task as they were praying, as they were casting vision, as they were gathering together, as they were working together, on a war foot setting, with weapons in their hands while they were building. And all of this really points to one thing, is that if we are going to build what God calls us to build, we need to have these same dimensions, and we need to realize that we're going to face these same obstacles. And we need to think about, when we get to that halfway mark, how do we finish? And we need to take advice from what Nehemiah did, the way he inspected the walls and then prayed. And then he basically gathered them together as one, and then they just kept building together. But before we close this message, before we close and bring this thing to a halt, I just want to mention to you the DBS assignment for this week because it connects with this. And it's Hebrews, reading chapter 8, verses 1 to 13, only 13 verses in at least 3 translations. And then you want to write down the translation you like you want to write it down exactly as it is. You want to write it in your own words, and you want to try to find what is the thing that I might be called to do. What is my I will statement? And that's when you're focused on Hebrews 8, verses 6 to 13. And the amazing thing you find in Hebrews 8 is the secret of the fact that Jesus brought a new covenant to us. And I really want to ask you, are you living in the new covenant that Jesus introduced, or are you still living in the old covenant or the Mosaic law that Hebrews 8 said is now obsolete? Father, I just pray for all of us. I pray that we would be on a war footing as Nehemiah was as we build what you call us to build, and that we realize that nothing gets built without prayer. That is the first work we have to do, and that we need to gather together as one. And then as we apply ourselves to what you call us to do, we need to realize in the end, it's the wind of the Holy Spirit that will accomplish anything. And it's actually what you're doing. It's your accomplishment through us. In Jesus' name, amen.